It flew just once, a wooden giant humiliating a senator who called it a flying lumberyard. Then it vanished. Howard Hughes spent $1 million a year keeping it ready in a climate-controlled hangar, waiting for a second flight that never came. Decades later, a crew in high-vis gear rows a rubber dinghy into a forgotten coastal hangar, the water lapping at a pale, cathedral-sized hull. The Spruce Goose is still here, half submerged and rotting, and we are going to finish what Hughes started. This is the Spruce Goose, Howard Hughes' flying giant, written off as a failed experiment. It sat in a climate-controlled hangar for decades, then was abandoned to flood and decay. Now we've uncovered it, and for the first time in history, a team is going to attempt the impossible, make it fly again. To understand why this plane is still here, we have to go back to 1942, when German U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than steel could be poured. The government begged for a cargo plane that could fly over the submarines entirely, a flying ship made of wood to save metal for tanks and bullets. Howard Hughes took the contract and spent 5 years building the largest wooden aircraft in history, with a wingspan longer than a football field, 8 engines, and a hull 5 stories tall. The Senate called it a flying lumberyard and accused him of stealing taxpayer money. So on November 2, 1947, Hughes climbed into the cockpit during a taxi test, pushed the throttles, and lifted the monster out of Long Beach Harbor just to prove them wrong. It flew for only 26 seconds, a single mile, and then he parked it in a climate-controlled hangar, swearing he would make a longer flight that would silence everyone. But he never did. For 29 years, he paid a crew of 300 to keep the Spruce Goose in perfect flight-ready condition, spending $1 million a year, guarding a secret he never revealed. When Hughes died in 1976, the secret was supposed to be lost forever. The plane was gifted away, turned into a tourist attraction, and eventually forgotten in a coastal hangar where salt water ate at its wooden bones. That's where we step in. I'm Gregory, and I've assembled a team of engineers, wood shipwrights like Dorothy, and aviation mechanics who refuse to let this legend rot. But when we finally pumped out the hangar and crawled inside the wing root, we found something that Hughes had hidden for over 70 years, compartments no one knew about, systems modified for a second flight that were never logged. And if we can restore what he started, we might just finish the flight that history said was impossible. The moment the last pump choked silent and the water level dropped below the wing root, we lit the floods and saw what decades of salt and neglect had done. The belly of the Spruce Goose was resting in 18 inches of black silt, and the lower hull planks had warped so badly that seams had opened wide enough to push a fist through. Dorothy, our master shipwright, ran her hand across the birch and just shook her head. Birch Duramold was supposed to be 80% stronger than aluminum, but even the toughest laminated wood cannot fight salt water forever. We had to strip every compromised plank, steam bend new sections, and relaminate them using the exact same hot press technique Hughes perfected in 1943. That was the visible damage. The real shock came when we opened the maintenance hatches inside the wing center section. Tucked behind a false bulkhead, covered in oilcloth and still dry after all these years, we found a hidden auxiliary fuel manifold and a hand-drawn schematic that did not match any known blueprint of the Hercules. Someone had re-engineered the fuel delivery system to feed 6 additional bladder tanks. Those tanks were never installed on the original flight, but they were on this plane. Hughes had already mapped a second flight that would stretch the range from 1 mile to over 1,500. He planned to fly from Long Beach to New York non-stop, just to prove the entire world wrong. And then he just waited. For nearly 30 years, he paid a skeleton crew to keep the machine ready, never pulling the trigger. We will never fully know why. What we do know is that the modifications were not finished. The new bladders had been test-fitted but not plumbed in, and the wing root hatches had been sealed and painted over, concealing the work from every mechanic who ever touched the aircraft afterward. Discovery number 1. Discovery number 2 came 3 days later when we pulled the port outer engine cowling and found the original Pratt & Whitney R4360 still bolted to its mount. its 28 cylinders caked in corrosion. And discovery number 3, the one that changed everything, was waiting inside the cockpit. Hidden under a rotted seat cushion was a leather flight log, its final entry dated November 2nd, 1947, and right below it, in Hughes' own handwriting, an unsent note. Kaiser was right. We will finish this. I refuse to let the bastards have the last word. That note became our mission. We dragged all 8 engines out on a gantry, tore them down to the crankshafts, and began the 3-month process of rebuilding 22,000 pounds of radial muscle. Dorothy began the painstaking work of cutting and laminating 40-foot birch planks, a skill that no modern aviation manufacturer even teaches anymore. Every day we fought the clock and the elements, because the hangar itself was collapsing, and the Spruce Goose was still sinking into the mud faster than we could lift it. But we knew something the Senate in 1947 never did. This plane was always meant to fly again, and it was built to survive exactly this moment. The only question was whether we could finish the final modification that even Hughes could not bring himself to complete. The deeper we cut into Howard Hughes' hidden modifications, the darker the picture became. The auxiliary fuel manifold we found in Act 2A was not just incomplete, it was deliberately cross-connected wrong. Hughes had plumbed the port wing tanks to feed the starboard engines, and the starboard tanks to feed the port engines, creating a crossover that no modern fuel system would ever allow. We stared at the hand-drawn schematic for 3 hours before our lead engineer slammed his fist on the drafting table. This was not a mistake. It was a deliberate choice that Hughes made and then abandoned. The reason only surfaced when Dorothy found a second note wedged behind the cockpit altimeter, one that Hughes never mentioned to anyone. It read, "Transfer test catastrophic at 30-second mark. Will not recover from roll moment. Am revising plan." The second flight was going to kill him. He had discovered a fatal asymmetry during a ground test of the hidden fuel bladders, and that was the real reason he kept the plane in that hangar for 29 years. Not pride, not fear of the Senate, but the fact that the plane he built to fly 1,500 miles would roll over and dive the moment the bladders shifted fuel. He never flew again because he could not solve the weight imbalance. When we announced our find to the crew, the mood collapsed. 3 months of hull work, 8 rebuilt engines, and now we were staring at a design flaw that defeated the smartest aviation mind of the 20th century. Dorothy walked out onto the wing and just stood there in the rain. But then she came back inside with a piece of chalk and drew one line on the fuselage blueprint. She pointed at the original ballast tanks that Hughes had installed for water taxi stability. Those tanks were never meant to hold fuel, but if we modified them to act as active trim bladders, pumping fuel forward and aft in real time, we could counteract the roll moment dynamically. It was a hack that Hughes never considered because he was fixated on a static solution. But it meant we had to cut into the hull again, and we had 5 days before the seasonal tide would flood the hangar basin and trap the plane for another year. We pulled all-night shifts, riveting and laminating through storms. A local historical society tried to slap a preservation injunction on us, claiming we were destroying a national treasure. We ignored them. The engines coughed to life one by one during a midnight test, the sound shaking the hangar so violently that rusted panels fell from the ceiling. On the final day, with water already seeping back into the basin, we rolled the Spruce Goose out onto the open water for the first time in decades. The hull groaned as it took the weight, and the wings flexed upward like they were breathing again. I stood in the cockpit, staring at the note from Hughes I had taped to the instrument panel. I refused to let the bastards have the last word. The throttles were in my hand. The runway of water stretched ahead. But as the last line was cast off, a Coast Guard cutter appeared on the horizon, radio blaring an order to cease all movement. Someone had called in an unauthorized flight test. The engines were warm, the plane was ready, and now we had seconds to decide whether to become criminals to finish the flight history denied. I did not even look at the radio. I pushed all 8 throttles forward, and the Spruce Goose surged across the water, the roar from 22,000 pounds of rebuilt radial engines ripping the morning apart. The Coast Guard cutter shouted again on the channel, but we were already accelerating past 30 knots, and the wings were biting the air. Dorothy stood in the navigator's station, watching the trim bladders push fuel forward, correcting the roll moment that had stumped Howard Hughes for a lifetime. The hull lifted 3 inches, then 3 feet, and then with a shudder that ran through every birch plank we had replaced, the largest wooden aircraft ever built broke free of the water for only the second time in history. We flew for 1 minute and 40 seconds, covering just under 2 miles at an altitude of 50 feet, the tail clearing the chop by a comfortable margin. No yaw, no roll, no catastrophic asymmetry. The crossover fuel system worked. The bird was stable. I leveled the wings and let the moment sink in, and then I spotted the note taped to the instrument panel fluttering in the cockpit breeze, and I thought of Howard Hughes sitting in this exact seat 75 years earlier, tasting flight and knowing he could not finish the puzzle alone. We touched down gently, taxied back, and tied up as the Coast Guard cutter pulled alongside with a bullhorn tirade that somehow felt completely beside the point. No charges were filed, only a furious report that never went anywhere, because the world wants a second flight more than it wants paperwork. Back inside the hangar, our crew was cheering, but Dorothy was already climbing into the hidden wing compartment one last time. She emerged holding a sealed copper tube, the kind used to protect blueprints on ships. Inside, we found a letter from Howard Hughes, dated January 1st, 1948, addressed to no one. It read, "To the pilots who finish this, the route to New York is plotted, the fuel stops are arranged. I leave you my challenge, do what I could not." Folded behind it was a full flight plan, Long Beach to LaGuardia, with handwritten notes on prevailing winds from 1947 that still hold true today. We had not just flown a test hop. We had unlocked the mission Hughes always intended, and the real flight is still ahead. The Spruce Goose was never a failure. It was a promise Howard Hughes made to himself, and then locked inside a hangar, waiting for the right hands to finish the work. We found those hidden compartments, rebuilt 28 cylinders that had been silent since 1947, and solved a weight imbalance that had grounded the largest wooden aircraft in history for 75 years. But the flight plan to New York is still folded in that copper tube, and the fuel stops are still marked on a map drawn by a man who refused to let the bastards have the last word. The question is not whether the plane can make it. It is whether we will. If you want to see the coast-to-coast flight that Hughes never got to make, hit subscribe and stay with us. The real journey is just beginning.